Greetings, brethren. Welcome to the Grand Hall of the United Grand Lodge of Ancient, Free and Accepted Masons of Queensland. The Australian-New Zealand Masonic Research Council is a coordinating body for Masonic research and is made up of 18 member lodges from the 7 Masonic jurisdictions across Australia and New Zealand. For over 20 years now, the ANZ Masonic Research Council has organised biennial conferences of these research lodges, and in the years in between conferences has welcomed eminent Masonic scholars to speak at each of the constituent lodges across Australia and New Zealand. In 2013, we take great pleasure in welcoming another outstanding Masonic scholar, researcher and lecturer, Brother Dr. Trevor Stewart. Brother Trevor is a retired university lecturer, a past master of 3 English lodges, including Quatuor Coronati Lodge number 2076, and a twice past master of the Scottish Research Lodge, Sir Robert Moray, number 1641. He has addressed the Grand Lodges in Greece, Turkey and Romania, the Pennsylvania Masonic Academy, the Philalethes Society, and 3 times he's been keynote speaker at the Allied Masonic Degrees gatherings in Washington, D.C. He has been honoured as a lecturer in New York, Missouri and California, and has had published his world-renowned English translation of the Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings by Martinez de Pasquale. And his research papers have been published in many Masonic periodicals in Europe and America, including, of course, the AQC, the Transactions of Quatuor Coronati Lodge. Brother Trevor has held offices in all of the orders that grace the English Masonic landscape, has served as a member of the High Council and Director of Studies of the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, and in 2004 he was appointed by the UGLE as their Prestonian Lecturer. On behalf of the ANZ Masonic Research Council in general and Barnett Lodge of Research in particular, I welcome Brother Trevor Stewart.
Thank you very much, Brother David. It's a great privilege and honour to me to be here, and I'm really looking forward to meeting fellow enthusiasts in all earths and pets, as we say in Scotland. It's a huge delight, a real privilege, and something of a challenge to make a tour of this nature.
Indeed, it is a large tour. If my information is correct, this is the 18th presentation you've given on this rather extended tour of Australasia, and you have at least another 7 presentations to go. So would you tell us a little about your lecture tour in the Antipodes thus far?
Well, as I said, it's a challenge. It's in fact a chance of a lifetime. I've undertaken other Masonic tours, lecture tours in the past, but never anyone, none of them as extensive as this one. I started out in Kuala Lumpur, then went to Singapore, then back to Kuala Lumpur, then to Hong Kong, and then to Bangkok, and then flew out from there to Auckland, and that's where the Australasian leg of the tour really took off. I've done an extensive tour of both the North and the South Islands of New Zealand, met some wonderful enthusiasts, learned a great deal just by listening to them and talking with them. And then I moved on from Auckland to Cairns, from the cold of Invercargill up to the tropics in North Queensland. And that's where I hit Australia, the first time I've been in Australia Masonically. So this is the start of my Australian leg, and I'm really looking forward to making some contribution to the enthusiasts and the way in which they tackle Freemasonry in Queensland.
Thank you. For your presentation to Barnett Lodge, our brethren have selected your research paper on the 1721 visit to Lodge Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, of John Theophilus Desaguilers. I wonder if you could tell us what led you to study this sometimes controversial visit, and what can you tell us of the background to that research?
Yes, I'm very pleased that the Lodge has chosen this particular topic, because it was one that I use it as an example of what one can do by referring directly to primary evidence in order to dispel some of the myths that have been circulating about Desaguliers bringing the third degree to Scotland. I looked at the minute book of Mary's Chapel because this is where the records actually start. Mary's Chapel, Edinburgh number 1, is a marvellous old lodge, described ancient even by the end of the 16th century by William Shaw, and they have a continuous set of minutes from 1599. And the value of the fact that they keep very careful records indeed. And what I did was to look at the entry for the August in 1721 and forensically dissect what was actually stated. I said that Desaguliers, the lodge, keeps very careful records. This was obviously an important occasion for them, and they took a great deal of time to examine Desaguliers, who, of course, came as past Grand Master of England. And they examined him and tested him to find that he was duly qualified in all the points of Masonry. I looked also at the names of the people who were involved in this particular lodge at the time, and those that were initiated into the lodge after Desaguliers' initial visit and meeting with the masters of the lodge. And I used, in a sense, a number of other sources, primary sources, to contextualize that visit, which I think is an important duty of a historian. It's not enough just to look at the particular event, but one needs to present a context for this, and that means in traveling far and wide in terms of other primary sources. And I thought that it would be important to find out where the third degree actually was performed in Scotland. And the first record that we have, of course, is in Dunbartonshire in 1726, after Desaguliers' visit. And we know for a fact that Desaguliers didn't visit the west coast of Scotland. But he had other reasons for being there. These 18th century gentlemen who were, and men of the Enlightenment, of course, had various kinds of reasons for making a journey from London to Edinburgh. And Desaguliers was, of course, in the employment of the Duke of Chandos. And part of the context of this visit was to explain why he was involved in the going out to Haddington to look at the water mills that produced potash for the manufacture of soap. But he was also there, of course, as a water engineer. His reputation had preceded him up to Edinburgh. In fact, he had been in Dunfermline over the Firth of Forth some time previously and had been advising the borough there in Dunfermline about their water supply. So the visit had a number of reasons why he was there in Edinburgh, and I wanted to chart these out particularly. The important thing as far as the myth was concerned is that Mary's Chapel, Edinburgh number 1, didn't start to work the third degree until some time after his visit. In fact, it began to work the degree about 1734. And indeed, it wasn't the first lodge in Edinburgh to do that. Canongate Kilwinning was the first to actually perform a ceremony of the third degree there. So one would have thought that if he'd introduced the third degree into Mary's Chapel, into Scotland in that way, they would have begun to work the degree almost immediately, but they didn't. And that was, I think, a crucial piece of evidence that perhaps this myth that had been growing up, that he had introduced the third degree in 1721, was in fact just that, a myth. And that's the background of the reason why I wrote the paper.
Fascinating. Well, thank you, Trevor. We really look forward to your presentation tonight, and once again, a very, very warm welcome to Queensland.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here.
Brethren, Barron, Barnett, Lodge of Research, number 146 on the roll of ancient, free and accepted Masons of Queensland, presents Worshipful Brother Dr. Trevor Stewart.
Worshipful Master, Most Worshipful Grand Master Mason,
and distinguished brethren all. Thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation for me to come here. This is the first time that I have visited Australia Masonically. It's taken me 70 years to get here. Well, that's my loss, because I'm having a great time. I only hope it's not another 70 years before I come back, because if I do, I'd be rather smelly and people will have to stand downwind of me. What I'm going to try to do tonight is to present you a summary of some new findings concerning an incident which is supposed to have happened in Edinburgh way back in 1721. And this became fascinating to me because the myth that goes around in England is that the great Dr. Jean Theophilus Desaguilers, third Grand Master of the Moderns Lodge, took the third degree to Scotland. And he did that on a visit to a famous old lodge which still exists, continues to exist, Mary's Chapel, number 1, Edinburgh, number 1. This is a famous lodge. In many ways, it regards itself as the Masonic lodge of the world. It has indeed records going back to 1599, continuous. And I mention that fact only because in trying to examine what appeared to be a myth, I was granted access to the minute books as a special favor. I'm mindful of the fact that this famous lodge doesn't always give access to its minute books. Then they do exist, I assure you, and they have been transcribed, perhaps not totally accurately, but they have been transcribed. I have handled them. I'm, in a way, a forensic historian. I accept the power of myths. They do operate in a different way from what I would call perhaps rational truth. But I believe that the only way that we can really cope with the wonderful history that we have of Freemasonry is to actually go back to the original documents as far as we can. And Scotland is very lucky in this. It does have a huge collection of documents of the lodges that exist up to, well, certainly before the founding of the Grand Lodge in 1736. In the anthology that accompanies this tour that I'm making, 26 locations, 40,000 air miles, including a train journey through the what's the name of the Tolkien book? Anyway, in New Zealand, including all of that, I have actually begun to think very much more carefully about presenting forensic evidence to you. And that's what I intend to do tonight. And that's why I'm particularly grateful to Mary's Chapel, number 1, for allowing me access to this, to the minute books. A little bit about Jean Theophilus Desaguilers. He was of French Huguenot extraction. He came and established himself very quickly as a scientist in London, a Fellow of the Royal Society, a close associate of the great Sir Isaac Newton, very much therefore involved in the Enlightenment, and a man of some considerable distinction and learning. He made his name as a hydrographer, in other words, someone who was a water engineer, among other things. He invented experiments in order to demonstrate the truth of Newtonian principles. And of course, since it was a very small city in those days, he quickly became prominent and well known and was elected to be the third Grand Master of the new Grand Lodge, which had been formed in 1717 in London. A man of some distinction, a man of some ingenuity, a man of some accomplishment. Now, the myth states that in 1721 he journeyed to Scotland, to Edinburgh, and in a conference which he had, a meeting which he had with the brethren of this famous old lodge, Edinburgh number 1, he was admitted a member, and he, by some dint of ingenuity, managed to persuade them to adopt a new degree, the third degree that we would recognize today. Because, of course, it is assumed that by then in London and elsewhere in England, the third degree had begun to be emerging and was beginning to be accepted. That in itself, of course, is questionable. And we won't go into that particular aspect of the problem there. There are a number of distinguished scholars who have asserted that that was in fact what happened. One of the most distinguished of these was a Scot, a Grand Secretary of Scotland, who wrote, David Lyons, who wrote a book of the history of the Lodge of Edinburgh, and the first edition of this appeared in around about 1900 to celebrate the tercentenary of that lodge, and he made that assertion, and the evidence is presented for that assertion in the anthology, the paper that I've got. He wasn't the only one, of course. There were others. Bernard Jones, who wrote the Freemasons' handbook, I think it's called, the Freemasons' Guide and Compendium. He went along with this, and years later, even in the transactions of my own English lodge, Quattro Coronati Lodge, there were papers saying just that very, very same thing. And the myth has continued in all kinds of encyclopedias that you would go to find, Mackay and Coyle and so on. If you're interested in doing Masonic research, those are names which will mean something to you. However, the evidence suggests something different. I'm the sort of guy who I don't like just to take things on face value. I want to go and see what the actual evidence is. And we're fortunate because Mary's Chapel, Edinburgh number 1, keeps complete records, and this was a record that they made in their second minute book, and it was done in a considerable amount of detail. And I'm going to read it for you. Bear with me, because I think it's important that I read it exactly what it says, and then I'm going to pick out the bones from this, and I'm going to try to flesh out some of them and to give you some of the details about that to substantiate what I am going to say about Desaguilers. You'll have the full text, of course, in the anthology, but bear with me. At Mary's Chapel on the 24th of August, 1721 year, James Watson, present deacon of the Masons of Edinburgh, presses. Oh, I won't go into all the reasons why he was called the deacon, not the master. Oh, that would take too long. The which day, the Dr. John Theophilus Desaguilers, Fellow of the Royal Society and Chaplain in Ordinary to His Grace James Duke of Chandos, late General Master General of the Masons' Lodges in England. That's Desaguilers. So they get a bit confused as to what he is. He's just was simply a Grand Master, but they got confused a bit about that. Being in town, and desirous of having a conference with the Deacon, Wardens and Master Masons of Edinburgh, which was accordingly granted. And finding him duly qualified in all points of masonry, they received him as a brother into their society. Likewise, upon the 25th day of the said month, the deacons, warden, master, and several other members of the society, together with the same Dr. Desaguilers, having met at Mary's Chapel, there was a supplication presented to them by John Campbell. And so they begin to list all the worthy men, the latest bigwigs in the town, who wanted to petition them to become a member of that famous lodge, the supplications were examined, and it was that's the second day he was there, and they admitted them, perhaps on his say-so. It doesn't say that, but on his say-so, his recommendation, they were admitted to be members of that lodge. And they were admitted and received as entered apprentice and fellows of craft. 2 degrees, brethren, not a third, just 2 degrees there. And there's another paper in the anthology which explains the whole background of that. So there were only entered apprentices and fellow crafts, however high these guys were, and some of them were very important gentlemen in Edinburgh at that time. And so it goes on that on the 28th day of that month, that's still August, that's 4 days after he had this conference with them, there was another petition, and Sir Duncan Campbell, notice a gentleman, another gentleman coming into this ostensibly an operative lodge, or at least a lodge of operative men. Another gentleman, Sir Duncan Campbell of Lochiel, Barnett, Robert Whiteman, Esquire, so we know he was a gentleman if they use that name, Esquire, Dean of Guild, of Edinburgh, George Drummond, Esquire, another gentleman comes in, and so the other ones come in, and so they're admitted as fellows of the Royals, of entered apprentices and fellows of craft. And then, just to make the point about this, there was also on the same day James Hogg and Thomas Aikman, servants of James Watson, deacon of the Masons, were admitted and received as entered apprentices and paid. And they paid the right fee. All these other posh guys were admitted free, but these 2 other ones weren't. There's a lesson there, I suppose. Now, let me just try to describe, if you don't know it already, and I imagine that some of you have some pictures in your minds of Edinburgh at that time. Essentially, it was the Edinburgh Castle to the south west, and then there was Holyrood Palace about a mile down to the southeast, and then it was more or less a straight processional route for the kings of Scots, not yet as we are now, to proceed from the palace up to the castle and likewise and so on. And running off that at right angles were these all piggledy little streets and old tenements and so on. It was a dirty, smelly place. It was well famous. It was called Auld Reekie, not for very good reason it was called Auld Reekie. It was a dirty, filthy town. Not very good water supply, and that's a very important reason why Desaguilers was present at that time. There was one lodge there existing, and it was Mary's Chapel. It was the famous old lodge which was described by William Shaw in 1599 in his statutes, 2 sets of statutes, as ancient even by the end of the 16th century. So it's an old established lodge of operative guys, most of whom worked with stone. But there were gentlemen by then, 1721, coming in. Actually, the first gentlemen admitted into that lodge were in 1633, almost 90 odd years previously. And they'd had a continuous record of gentlemen joining this lodge because, well, and again, I'm presuming that you'll delve into the anthology. These lodges were not just working what you might call operative stonemasonry, and they were involved in some hermetic or hermetic practices of one sort or another. You have to read the paper in the anthology to get what I'm alluding to. Anyway, so these gentlemen were coming in, and they were being received, and they played a part in moulding the way those lodges worked gradually over the years. And the lodge met in Nidri Street, which still exists, but it doesn't exist as it is now, as it was then. And it's one of these small winding streets that go off the main thoroughfare, going down from the castle to the Palace of Holyrood. It's important, I think, to notice that this town had a great difficulty in getting good water supplies. The water pressure wasn't, because it was basically on a hill, it's difficult to get gravity feed to operate. So it is a real problem, and it always had problems. And some of these problems were exacerbated by numerous fires that they had from time to time. The water came into a great system near the castle, a great reservoir that they had there from Coniston Springs, which were about 3 miles outside of the actual borough, as it then was. Not a city, but a borough. And it then was distributed by gravity feed into fountains going down the hill. And the houses in those days didn't have any running water supply at all. They had to, those who were important people had servants who go out and collect the water from 7 standpipes that were, or fountains that were around the various locations as they on the main thoroughfare at that time. So if you have fires and if you have great tall buildings, because, well, the town couldn't expand that way laterally, so it had to go up that way. You have problems. You have health problems, you have sewage problems, you have fire risk problems. And a good water supply became important. And there are many reports in the archives of Edinburgh town, or city as it is now, to that effect. Fires, bad water supply, the water supply would stop and people would worry about where they were going to get water from. It was a perennial problem there. And that was why Desaguilers was invited to come to Edinburgh. He had already established his reputation as a hydrostatician. In other words, someone who was skilled water engineer. His employer in England, the great Duke of Chandos, was a very wealthy man, and he had already instituted waterworks, fountains and so on at his country retreat, great cascades of fountains and so on. The wealthy people could pay for those kind of things in those days, and Desaguilers was involved at least in one of those. And he was also involved in other water schemes down on the River Thames. So he was practically putting into effect Newtonian principles, but finding practical solutions to the difficulties, applying Newtonian principles to them, and coming up with the answers. He was already a fellow of the Royal Society, but he was a practical man, inventing experiments to prove Newton's principles, but also working as a water engineer, solving the problems of the increasing urbanization that was taking place, not all over England, not all over in Scotland, but into the bigger cities. Cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow and London, of course, and Birmingham and Liverpool and Manchester in the further north of England.
A man who had acquired a considerable amount of skill, therefore, and came highly recommended as a water engineer. And it was for that reason that he was particularly invited to come to Edinburgh, to try and help them to solve their problems as far as water is concerned. It mentions that, the record mentions that he is a chaplain, because he was a clergyman as well, a man of many talents. He was a clergyman as well, although perhaps not a very good, he was an absentee vicar for most of the time, but he was a clergyman to the great Duke of Chandos. Now the Duke of Chandos was we would call him an entrepreneur. He was a wide boy. Some people might even call him a bit of a spiv. He made a lot, he made quite a bit of money exploiting various natural resources, and he invited Desaguilers and others to go and dine with him. In America, we have the guest book of the palace, or great house that he had, and when you went there, you signed it in and so on, and it's in America now, in California, and I've seen it, and there you can see the signatures of all the great people, including Desaguilers, who was invited there to be present on several occasions as the local vicar. Chandos gave him a job as the vicar of the local parish near the big house which he owned on the outskirts of London in those days. Chandos was a businessman, and he had a sharp eye for promoting good business, and he therefore spotted water engineers and hydrostaticians and anyone else who would be able to improve the kind of investments that he was making. He'd lost a lot of money in the great South Sea bubble. He'd lost well over £10,000. Now that might not seem much now, perhaps, to some, but it was a great deal of money then. And he wanted to recoup this, and naturally enough wanted to find a means of getting some of that back. There's a reason why I mentioned that, which will come a little clearer just now. He was in town, so the record says. He happened to be in town, but he just didn't happen to be in town. He was there for a specific purpose. Chandos had asked him to be there. I mentioned also that Edinburgh had a particular water problem. So it wasn't just by accident that Desaguilers happened to be there in 1721. Chandos was looking for something, and I think I found the clue as to what he was looking for. He wasn't so much interested in Edinburgh. Why should he be? But it just happened to be something handy near at hand, which he was very interested in. And as I say, in due course, I'll explain what that might mean. The Borough Council was the one who actually invited, there was the body that actually invited Desaguilers to be there. He'd already got a bit of a reputation amongst Edinburgh intelligentsia because he had translated one of the leading medical books into Latin. A book that had been written in Latin by one of the Scottish doctors. He translated it from Latin into English. So he had already endeared himself to Scots, at least in that way anyway. He had already been also into Dunfermline, which is just over the Firth of Forth. We know that because they had honoured him and made him a burgess, in other words, a freeman of that particular town, because of the work that he had been doing on the water supply for that town. So he had a proven record in a way. As far as Edinburgh was concerned, he was a man, he was a scientist, he was friendly, or at least associated with Isaac Newton, the great man of the century in science, and he was also well known, not too far away, over in Dunfermline in Fife for being a water engineer. So they invited him to be there, and in the paper, in the anthology, I give you a lot of details about his general background as to how he managed his affairs as far as water engineering is concerned. It's interesting that he had already been to Edinburgh in the January of that year. There was a small reference that I came across in the town archives. This visit that he made to Mary's Chapel in the August wasn't the first time he'd been to Edinburgh. Hidden away in the archives, I came across a reference dated the 20th of January that same year that Dr. Desaguilers had been made a freeman of the city of Edinburgh. And it was a meeting of the city, of the Guild of Burgesses, that was opened in ample form. Now that phrase, ample form, is a clue. It only ever takes place when the actual leading dean of the Guild of Freemen was present. Just as, for example, when the Grand Lodge is opened, usually is opened in ample form because the Grand Master himself is present in that way. So it is, I think, fairly clear that Desaguilers had already been to Edinburgh on a previous visit on that same year. Well, he came and he had a conference with the members of the Lodge of Edinburgh. I'll remind you what the phrase is. Desirous of having a conference with the deacon wardens and master masons of Edinburgh. It doesn't say that he was wanting to join a meeting of the lodge. He just wanted to have a talk with them. He just wanted to have a discussion with them. And it was because that he was desirous of, other scholars have interpreted this, that he was wanting to have a meeting of the lodge as such, wanting to join in with the meeting of the lodge, that the various scholars have said that he was wanting to join the lodge, or at least he became a member of that lodge. Well, I'm afraid that's not quite exactly what happened. This was a meeting which took place at his own initiative. He asked to have the meeting. It was not at the instigation of the members of the lodge. So he must have known that before the 24th of August, who to approach. He must have known who to ask. He was a stranger in a sense, well, almost a stranger. Perhaps because he'd been already there early in the year, he knew who to approach. But in virtual terms, he wasn't a well-known person as far as the Edinburgh Lodge was concerned. They had a debate, or so they say. But what was the debate about? Some people have suggested that it was for him to bring the third degree into Edinburgh, into Scotland, and so on. But the record actually doesn't state that. It doesn't say that at all. It just simply says, being desirous of having a conference with the brethren of the lodge. There are a number of issues relating to that. If he had had an intention of introducing a new degree into Scotland, he would have encountered a considerable amount of resistance. Scottish lodges are fiercely independent, and they don't take much notice. Some of the older ones don't take any notice at all. Well, that's an exaggeration. They don't take much notice of what Edinburgh has to say, and particularly since it's dominated by lawyers. I hope I'm not treading on too many toes here tonight. After all, some of these old lodges have been going for a long time. Mother Kilwinning claims, of course, to be from time immemorial almost. Lodge of Edinburgh, as I've already stated, had been, the first record it had was dated 1599. The Shaw Statutes, 1598, 1599, two sets, mention a list of lodges, and he describes them, William Shaw, Master of the King's Works, under James VI, he describes them as ancient, ancient even by the end of the 16th century. So these lodges have been going on quite a long time. Melrose, a wee border town between Scotland and England, well, it's actually in Scotland, a place of no significance whatsoever nowadays, a wee market town, very pleasant place. Go and visit it if you can. It has an ancient abbey which is ruined. But it has archaeological evidence. It's this carved lintel above a doorway, which of course the building, the doorway has long disappeared, but the carved lintel still exists. And it refers to a John Wayne who was master of the St. John's men, and it is dated 1194. So a lodge like that is not going to take much notice of this newfangled thing which was invented in Edinburgh in 1736. They called it a Grand Lodge. Particularly as it was formed by a minority of lodges. Only 12, I think, bothered to turn up, and one of them went away in disgust and wasn't going to have anything to do with it. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the introduction of something new would have been viewed very suspiciously indeed, particularly as it was coming outside of Edinburgh, outside of Scotland, from down in England. You need to bear that in mind when I'm going to tell you some of the facts about the whole situation as it transpired a wee bit later on. The conference that he wanted was granted. In other words, the lodge had met privately and discussed this. We got this Englishman. He's a Frenchman by name, and he's come up from London, and he says he's the 30 Grand Master, or past Grand Master, and do you want to hear him? And they said, yeah, okay, we'll hear him. So they granted him the favour of this. These are my interpretations of what is written down in the book, but the book doesn't reveal every nuance, but Scots are very succinct in what they say at times, and the words do hide, I believe, a certain sort of subtlety there. And it says, finding him duly qualified. Oh, they tested him. They weren't going to take him at his word. They tested him, however grand he said he was, or however big he said he was, or however learned he said he was. These men tested him, and they tested him presumably using the catechism set out in the Edinburgh Register House manuscript. Again, a paper which is in the anthology. So, again, if you want the details, get the book and read the By the way, I don't make any money out of it at all, so I thought I'd better tell you that. So they tested him according to the procedures that they knew, and they realized that he was a duly qualified man. He was what he said he was, a Mason. They would hardly have been able to test him with the questions relating to the third degree because they didn't know it. So they only tested him with the questions that they knew relating to the apprentice, entered apprentice and fellow of craft. And he was able to supply the right answers for that. That's interesting, because the system that has been espoused in the Edinburgh Register House manuscript is one throughout the whole of Scotland, and I adduce the evidence for that. Which means that the same sort of ideas that contained in a Scottish manuscript, the earliest known ritual that we know, 1696 it's dated, was also the technique or the knowledge that was based in England at that time. Similar, yes, but not identical perhaps. So this gives us a valuable clue as to what Elias Ashmole was interested in and what he got up to when he was initiated in England by an occasional lodge in 1646 during the English Civil War. And they tested him on all points of masonry. So they were a thorough kind of test. And then it says, and they received him as a brother into their society. Now, it doesn't mean that they accepted him as an initiate or an affiliate or a fellow or anything like that. It doesn't say that. The words, the minute book says, they received him as a brother into their society. Nothing more. Now, there's a lot of evidence about, in the minute book that I've looked at, what happens when a gentleman comes and he's admitted. And there's a lot of evidence going from back into 1634, for instance, when Sir Alexander Strachan of Thornton was admitted. But he was admitted a fellow craft. It states exactly the status that he had. Again, there was in 1674, James Cars, who was a mathematician, and 5 others were admitted and received as fellows of the craft of the Lodge of Edinburgh. It states exactly the status that they had. Robert Allison in 1709, a writer in Edinburgh, that means a solicitor, a writer of the signet, as they term it. He was admitted, entered apprentice and fellow of craft to serve the lodge as clerk. Again, it states exactly his status within the lodge. In 1710, Mr. Alexander Nesbitt, a surgeon, apothecary, Mr. Alexander McGill, an architector, Mr. William Elphinstone, were Wrights and Burgesses. They were entered and passed, entered apprentices and fellow of crafts, all free. They were a gentleman, so they were admitted free. But the status that they were, it says that they were admitted proper members of this lodge. It doesn't say that about Desaguilers. All it says was he was admitted let me get the wording correctly, just to remind you of the word. They received him as a brother into their society. It doesn't mean to say that they admitted him into their lodge, just into their company, into their presence. They recognized him as a brother, but they didn't make him a member of the lodge. And he certainly didn't sign the book. And all of these other men, these gentlemen who were admitted, either entered apprentices or fellow of crafts, they all signed the book when they came in. His signature is not there. Therefore, he was not a member of that lodge. That, I think, is important. So, he was received into their society, and he had a conference with them, and he had a meeting with them. It says that they met on the 20th day of the 25th of the day of that month, but that was an unusual date. They didn't usually meet in August. They met at other times of the year. And so they had a special meeting on the day after. He met with them on the 24th. On the 25th, he brought these other guys in, recommending them to them. And these other gentlemen, I present a lot of details about them. I won't go into the details now. Some of them were rogues. Some of them were important. There was one, the Lord Provost, the mayor of the town, and so on. He was responsible for putting, or at least imprisoning, some of the Jacobites in 1715, so we know where he stood as far as the Stewarts were concerned. Oh, yes, and of course his name was Campbell, wasn't he? So he knew which. So he was brought in as the leading man at Desaguilers' recommendation, and it's interesting that there was a tie-up between this man, John Campbell, and Desaguliers and Chandos. I found the records of Chandos's dining who dined there at his table, and it's in America, as I've said. And lo and behold, here we get John Campbell, who was dining with the Duke of Chandos on the same night that Desaguilers was dining there. So there was a tie-up in London between these two before Desaguilers had gone to Edinburgh. And likewise, there was John Preston, who was a public civic official. He was an important man in the town at that time. Hugh Hawthorne, he was a merchant, an important man. James Jimmer was the treasurer. He would be a very important man in the city at that time. And then we have the William Livingston, the deacon convener of the trades. In other words, the man who controlled all the trades organizations in the city at that time. An important man. He was the head of that. And there was George Irving, clerk to the Dean of Guildcourt, again, an officer, somebody who had his hand on the purse strings. And, of course, as every secretary knows, he who wields the pen wields the sword. So he was an important man, and they admitted to be members of this society and so on. And they were received, admitted, as apprentices and fellows of crafts. They didn't pay. Of course, they wouldn't pay. It's interesting to point out to you, brethren, the reason for this. What was the lodge getting out of it? Well, they were getting some kudos. They were getting these important men joining. They were becoming perhaps embedded into Edinburgh society, especially after the Act of Union, which brought the two kingdoms, England and Scotland, together in 1707. So it was a move, I think, a political move perhaps, to acquire these important civic officials. Some of them had questionable backgrounds, but nevertheless they were elected and they were in place. And it perhaps was a wise move on the behalf of the old lodge to acquire them and to bring them in. It had, of course, one unfortunate reaction. It led almost very soon in 1700, it had been a process that had been going on for some time. So some years before this, there had been formed a journeyman lodge. There had been a real brouhaha in the Lodge of Edinburgh about these modern gentlemen coming in, changing things, wanting things written down properly and so on. They were all lawyers and so on, particularly those who were brought in 1670 and so on. Some of the older guys, who were of older mentality, decided they were going to. There was a row about. It was about money, of course. Inevitably, it always is. And then they broke off and they formed a lodge called Journeyman Masons No. 8. It still exists, and the birth of that lodge was born in acrimony. So we have this happening all over Scotland. I have evidence, again, in another paper in the anthology, which goes to prove that this process of lodges gradually changing their character from being operative masons, stonemasons, guys who got their hands dirty in the quarries, they were admitting members who were, shall we say, more esoteric. Men who were gentlemen, men who were more well-read, yes, men who were skilled in Latin, men who had travelled extensively, perhaps some of them, out with Edinburgh, out with Scotland, indeed. And the argument would go that by some of them coming in, not in very great numbers, but gradually the character of these lodges changed. And by 1721, this process was well underway. So having a gentleman come from London with polished London accents, perhaps speaking with a French accent, one doesn't know, Desaguilers, fellow of the Royal Society, friend of Newton and all the rest of it, was not entirely unusual for a lodge like Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel number 1. This had been going on in their company since 1634, certainly for about 100 years, well, almost 100 years now. And not only in Edinburgh, but in other places too. So by bringing these great civic officials in as members and admitting them free, yes, the lodge was getting kudos from them, this extra status. They were embedding themselves as a potent force within the body politic of the city at that time. And by extension, of course, these gentlemen, not these ones particularly, but others like Sir Robert Murray and others, were getting access to ancient wisdom, perhaps. And let's put it no more definitively than that. The same day, they were on the 28th of that day. They'd obviously got a spurt of activity now, because they'd meeting now 3 times in the 1 month, 24th, 25th and 28th, 3 meetings in 1 month. The lodge admitted others who were likewise gentlemen. Duncan Campbell, Sir Duncan Campbell of Lochiel, Robert Whiteman, the Dean of Guild of Edinburgh, not just his clerk, but the one who actually had the real power. Dean of Guild was a man who could make or break a mason, a stonemason. He handed out the contracts for the buildings. He was the one who controlled what kind of building work was being done in Edinburgh at that time. So he was a man of some considerable consequence. And George Drummond, of course, the treasurer of the Dean of the Guild, and Archibald Macaulay, late Bailey, in other words, a councillor, was admitted, and so on, and Patrick Lindsay, the merchant. So Patrick Lindsay came from an old aristocratic family in Scotland. He had wealth, and he also had ancestry behind him. He wasn't just a newcomer into the game. He has a long established aristocratic family. So what have we got? We've got old established families now coming into membership of this lodge, and they were received as members of the society as the other persons named. In other words, they were admitted as entered apprentices and fellow of crafts, but they didn't have to pay either. I feel sorry for James Hogg and Thomas Aikman, who were servants, and they came when Desaguilers presumably was around there, and they were admitted and received as apprentices, and they paid. Now, why did he come? Well, he came to solve the problem for the water supply. That was the ostensible reason. And he made certain recommendations to the Edinburgh Council, and of course, being who he was, they accepted it. The plans were drawn up, the expense of the it was all budgeted for, and off he went back to London. And on the great day when the whole thing was being set up and the taps were to be turned on near the Edinburgh Castle, the damn thing didn't work. Turned the taps on, there's no water come out. And no doubt there were a lot of red faces around, and no doubt as politicians they were wondering, well, who can we blame? And it took an older workman, whose name escapes me at the moment, but I've got it down in the text. And he said, "Nah, I've got an idea. We'll ease the water pressure." Water pressure? Oh. So off he goes on his horse, and he rides out a couple of miles outside, and he drills a few holes in the pipe and so on, and that relieves the water pressure. So the water begins to roll through the great scheme that Desaguilers had charged the money for, but he'd gone back to London by then. That wasn't the real reason why he was there, though. Hidden among the diaries and hidden among other records at the time It describes what he was doing while he was there in Edinburgh. And it just shows you how interconnected these things are. We think in terms of you're visiting a lodge and you're just visiting a place for a Masonic reason. But I don't think they did things like that in the 18th century. There was always not a hidden motive, but there were other motives. I mean, after all, going from London to Edinburgh in those days was a matter of some considerable distance and some considerable risk. Not something that you undertook lightly, even in pleasant weather in the August. There are records that tell us exactly why it was that he was there. While he was in Edinburgh and before he met with the men of the lodge, he made a journey out to Haddington. Haddington is a town about 26 or 27 miles outside of Edinburgh to the south. Again, an ancient place, and it did have a lodge at one time, but when Desaguilers was visiting, it didn't have a lodge. The lodge had ceased to meet by then. Very old lodge, but it had gone. So why would he go there? What possible reason would he have? Well, some have speculated that it was to see the famous sundial that was there that had been carved by a stonemason. And of course, Scotland doesn't get a lot of sun, so why would they have sundials? It was a scientific instrument. It was a means of determining all kinds of astrological information, not just the time of the day. Well, that could have been a reason, but there was a more potent reason. Desaguilers, always a man for the main chance, always somebody who was willing to make a bit of money on the side. I had records now that show that he had been sent there by Chandos. Chandos had lost a lot of money in the sea bubble, as I've told you. And he was a shareholder in the Africa company that manufactured soap. And it needed potash to do this. But the shipping wasn't very secure. The actual, after the South Sea bubble, the economic crisis, so that sort of thing, it was a huge concern at that time. Men lost a lot of money, some of them foolishly, others by just happened to be there at the wrong time. But Chandos was one of them. And he wanted to recoup some of the money, and he wanted to make sure that the soap manufacture was continued. Now, we might think that that's a simple enough matter, but it isn't. It needs potash in order to start that process off. And he therefore wanted to secure potash supplies, cheaply, yes, and reasonably conveniently, not going to Africa for the potash. And he got to know, by various means, I guess, that the weaving machines, the weaving looms at Haddington were steam-powered. Not high water-powered, but steam-powered. And of course, therefore, they needed fires. And therefore, they produced potash from the ashes. And therefore, there was a good supply of potash that could be exported from Haddington, not very far across the land, not very far to a town called Berwick. It's a port on the east coast, from where the ships could sail down to London. And so I believe that that was a very good reason why Desaguilers visited Haddington while he was there in Edinburgh, why he would have been there in Edinburgh in any case at that time. That's not the end of the story. It says that the myth says that he brought the third degree to the Lodge of Edinburgh, to Scotland. Well, he didn't, and I'll tell you for why. The Lodge of Edinburgh, that's where he met. He met the people there, the brethren, in 1721. They didn't start working the third degree until 1734. They worked it after Canongate Quilling number 2. Canongate Kilwinning, another famous old lodge, just down the street from where Mary's Chapel used to meet, nearer to the Holyrood Palace. They worked the 3rd degree before. And they weren't the first. The first one to work them was over in Lanarkshire. And they weren't the first either, because there was a lodge over in Dumbarton, that worked the 3rd degree that we know of in Scotland in 1726. But Desaguilers never visited that part of Scotland. We know that for certain. And if you trace on a sketch map of Scotland, it seems that it's working its way from the west of Scotland, southwest, into the central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and then suddenly it goes to Edinburgh, but not Lodge of Edinburgh, to Canongate Kilwinning, and then just a wee bit up the street it goes to Edinburgh Mary's Chapel number 1. Now you would have thought that if he'd brought the 3rd degree Freemasonry to Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel would have noted it in their records in 1721, but they didn't. There's no mention of the 3rd degree in Edinburgh being worked before 1732, 33. Canongate Kilwinning first, then very shortly after that, within a matter of months, into Edinburgh number 1. And on that ground, I would think that the myth really is, yes, a myth, a fascinating myth, but it certainly doesn't bear evidence. It certainly doesn't bear up with the evidence that I've been able to detect. What does this matter? Why do we bother about some things like this? Well, we bother about them because myths are important. We celebrate, of course, in our 3rd degree a myth. We celebrate in our 2nd degree a myth about Jephthah and the Ephraimites and so on. The potency is not lying in their historical accuracy, but in the appeal to us as symbols. And of course, we are all speculative Masons, and therefore we should rejoice in being able to speculate about the symbols that we have before us. Worshipful Master.